Also, holiness was not secluded to the spiritual leaders, such as the high priest or the priest. It was not secluded to the wealthy or even the poor. It was not secluded to the government officials. Rather, holiness was to be a way of life for everyone. This is what Leviticus taught them. Even though we are no longer under these laws, we're no longer to follow Leviticus as our commandments, but we still serve the same God today. And God has told us and commanded us that we are to be holy. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15. For that reason, this legal book has been preserved for us so that we may know the source of all holiness. That's God. And this book has been preserved for us so that we may know the consequences. That there is consequences when people do not live holy. Also, it has been preserved for us not only because of that, but we see that there's blessings to those who do live holy. In these chapters 23 through 27, God will continue to teach us the underlying principles of living holy. But before we do, let's go to God in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we approach your throne humbly, Lord. We thank you so much for giving us books such as Leviticus so that we can learn more about holiness, so that we may have a better understanding of holiness in the New Testament. We thank you, Lord, for teaching us how to be holy, how to remain holy and to grow in holiness so that we can have fellowship with you. We thank you for Jesus Christ and the sacrifice that was made. We thank you for allowing us to become your children, to have that hope to be with you one day. We hope, Lord, that we study diligently and put these things into practice, the things that apply to us. In Jesus' name we ask, we pray. Amen. Chapter 23, Holiness in God's Feast. Holiness in God's Feast. Now this chapter, it lists 8 different feasts or festivals that the people of Israel had to follow. Really, there's 7, because the Passover and the unleavened bread are so closely connected that it's pretty much considered one holiday. Now, these were holidays, and simply means holy days. They were holy days in that they were set apart from regular days for divine service. They were to partake of certain actions, and they were also to stop certain actions, such as work. All of these holidays that were given to them, they were to rest from their work. Now, that said, these were not holy days that people made up. These were given by God. In observing these holy days, they kept themselves holy by following God's commands. Now, later on through the centuries, the Jews would eventually add their own festivals or feasts, but they were never commanded by God, and they were never needed for individual holiness. When we get to the book of Esther, we see people, they add a festival called the Feast of Purim. When we get to talking about the times in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, they add this Feast of Dedication. And this was to remember the time when the temple was made holy once again, or purified, because someone named Antiochus Epiphanes came in there and defiled the temple. And so it reminded them of the victory that they had. Now this feast, the Feast of Dedication, which is not in here in Leviticus, it is mentioned in John chapter 10 and verse 22. And it says in verse 23 that Jesus walked into the temple during this Feast of Dedication. Now, some people will then say that God allowed people or Israel to add holidays because Jesus celebrated it in John chapter 10. However, that goes beyond the context. was actually celebrating the Feast of Dedication. It doesn't show him partaking of any of the festivities. It just shows him coming into the temple on that particular time. It's just a time peg. During that Feast of Dedication, Jesus came in. Now, I bring this up because the reason people will try to prove that Jesus was celebrating the Feast of Dedication is so that they can prove that we can make up our own holidays under Christ's law. Now, there's nothing wrong, there's certainly nothing wrong with remembering certain victories that we have as Americans. I mean, we have Veterans Day, we have Memorial Day, Independence Day, and so we remember the victories. But we also have to understand those days are not under Christ's law. Now, as Americans celebrating those occasions, they do help us unite as a people. You know, that's pretty much the same reason God gave them these feasts. So they come together and they enjoy fellowship with one another. They're resting, they're joyous, and they partake of it together. Yeah, that's why he calls it a holy convocation. It's a holy assembly. They do it together. But if one does not celebrate the American holidays, it's not a sin because they're not commanded by God per se. Now, when we consider religious type holidays that society has made up or other denominations, such as Christmas, for example, it is a holiday in a loose sense that we're remembering something, but it's not a holy day under Christ's law. Now, there's nothing wrong with remembering Christ's birth, okay? There's nothing wrong with it. And there's nothing wrong with thanking God for that occurrence. But if one were to choose not to celebrate that day, it's not a sin. Because God never commanded us to do anything on December 25th. Now, we have only one holy day, and that is what? First day of the week, Sunday. It's holy. What does the word holy mean? We've learned throughout Leviticus. Set apart to do divine service. Sunday, the first day of the week, is set apart from all the other days so that we can worship. We have to worship on that day. Now, if someone fails or rejects or does not worship on that day or chooses not to, it's a sin because that day has to be observed. Now, just because Sunday is set apart, we also have to understand that does not mean that on Sunday we have to live holy only on that day. It does not mean that we have to be extra holy on Sunday. That day is only set apart for us to do the worship acts. That's it. When should we be living holy? All the time. It's not just included to Sunday. It's the same thing with the Israelites back then. The festivals that are listed here in chapter 23, God has not given them these days so that they can be only holy on these days. But in keeping these days and doing what God says on those days, they keep themselves holy. And then all the other days, they still have to do what God says and what he commands. So, going back to Israel's feasts. These feasts are given in chronological order. First one being the Sabbath, which was one of the first ones that was given, the Passover, the unleavened bread, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Weeks in verses 15 through 22. That is a good one to study because that's basically the day of Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2, when the church was started. And when you do your research on the Feast of Weeks, the Pentecost festival, you'll understand that every time that it happened or occurred, it was always on the first day of the week, which is interesting. The church was started on that day. We also have the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, these feasts, we're not going to go into detail because when we get into the book of Numbers, specifically in Numbers chapter also in Deuteronomy, we're going to see these feasts again. And so we'll give more details as that comes up. But some things I want us, when you go study this chapter and you look at these different feasts, be looking for how many times the word Sabbath comes out. Every single one of these feasts or festivals, the word Sabbath comes out. Now the first one is called the Sabbath. It's the last day of the week, and on that day they should do no work. But this ceasing of work, this rest, is to be extended through all these holidays. They're not to work in any of these. They're all to be a time of rest. And this helps them. Also, this does not mean, and I've said this before, this does not mean that Sunday is a day that we have to rest. Okay? The reason that they rested here in these feasts is because God commanded it. God never commanded us to fully rest all day. Now, you can choose to do that if you want, but it's not part of the doctrine. All right. When you study these holy days, also understand that we're not to observe them anymore. Galatians chapter 4, verse 10 says that they're taken away, just like with the rest of the old law. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16 says that we no longer are judged according to these days. But even in Colossians chapter 2, it teaches that these feasts, they point to Christ in some way. And some of these feasts we already talked about in great detail, like the Day of Atonement. We spent a great deal of time in class talking about that and how that day points to Christ. We've talked a lot about the Sabbath. We've talked a lot about the Passover and the unleavened bread and how all that points to Christ in the church. But we will do it again when we come to Numbers. Does anybody have any questions or comments concerning that chapter? All right. Let's go to chapter 24. God's name. Holiness in God's name. Now, the first part of this chapter, it has two aspects of the tabernacle before it talks about his name. Two things that they had to understand, the people of Israel. They had to keep the lights burning in the tabernacle. And they had to keep the unleavened bread good by changing it every week. Now, some people may say, well, why does God just all of a sudden talk about the tabernacle? What does this have to do with any of this? Well, if you think about it, during the feast and all the events and all the activities that are going on, they may forget to do the daily things or the weekly things. So God reminds them, keep this up. Even though you're doing all these festivities, keep this up. The second part of the chapter deals with blasphemy against God's name. And to get the point across, God uses a specific case of a man who was punished for this. In chapter 24. Let's look at verse 10. Now the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the children of Israel, and this Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought each other in the camp. And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed, literally pierced, the name of the Lord and cursed. And so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, and the daughter of Dibri, the tribe of Dan. Then they put him in custody, that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take outside the camp him who is cursed. Then let all who heard him lay their hands on him, and let all the congregation stone him. So, pretty serious business. God's name. It gets the point across. Now, this is interesting. When we consider the whole book of Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, as we've seen, is divided into two sections. We saw the first one, especially chapters 1 through 7, that shows how to become holy. And that's through what? How does one become holy? It's through what? Sacrifice, right? Through a sacrifice, chapter 1 through 7. And who does the sacrifices? The priest. What happens if the priest does not do his job right? Death. Now, to get the point across, what does God Sacrifice. The priests come and they make the sacrifice. If they don't do their job, death will occur as a punishment. Okay? So God, to make the point across, he gives them an example or a case where Nadab and Abihu received that punishment. So the people know that God means business. Now the second part of Leviticus comes around and says to the people, everyone, now that you have been made holy from these sacrifices, you need to remain holy. You have to live holy. Now to get the point across, if you don't live holy, if you live carelessly like this man who used God's name carelessly, what's going to happen? You're going to be punished. Death. And to get the point across, he's given an example. And so, to the priests, obey God's commands. If you don't, this is what happens. To the rest of the people, live holy. If you don't, this is what happens. So, Leviticus is arranged very, very logically. So, when we think about our law, it's the same for us. Living holy is serious business. If one lives carelessly under Christ's law, like this man who carelessly used God's name, what's going to happen to us at the end of the age? Punishment. And what is that a punishment? Death. Eternal death. Does God give us examples? We have them right here in Leviticus. How do we know that God will keep his promise that he will destroy the wicked and that he will reward the righteous? How do we know that? Because when God made those promises to Israel, he fulfilled it. He did it. And so, we look back at the mistakes of the people back then. They were to live holy just as we are to live holy. They served the same holy God as we serve the same holy God. Nothing has really changed except the commandments, but God still expects us to obey. If we don't, we will be punished. Now, to be more specific, James chapter 2 and verse 7 lets us know that speaking evil of the Lord's name today is still a sin. Now, we may not know how to pronounce God's true name exactly, okay? Because we already done a study on that, how the Hebrew translators, they didn't put the full name, they didn't put the full vowels, and so what we came up with is Jehovah. But we still got to understand that whatever we do have, it still represents God. And so we should not use his name in a careless manner. Plus, evil speaking and cursing should not be a part of our language anyway. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that? Yes, sir.
It's important to realize that, again, you just mentioned it, it's not good to have bad speech, regardless, but this word blaspheme shows the intent of the heart. It was an injurious reference to God, not just saying a bad word.
Yes.
But it denotes an attitude, even saying something libelous toward God. So it's far more serious than just uttering a bad word.
Yes. And that's true. And even when you look at James chapter 2 and verse 7, the reason that they were blaspheming is because they didn't, they're showing that they didn't want nothing to do with God. And what he was doing there is showing, why do you uphold the rich when the rich they're the ones that are blaspheming the name of God. They're the ones that are throwing you in prison and all these things. So blasphemy can lead to other sins because it shows the attitude of the heart. All right. Good comments. Holiness in God's rest and release, chapter 25. Holiness in God's rest and release. Now, just as there was a day of rest in each week, there was a certain year of rest. Every 7 years, the seventh year would be the Sabbath year. Guess what they couldn't do throughout that whole year? They couldn't work. Just like on the Sabbath day, they had to cease their work. Same for the Sabbath rest. It's very interesting when you look at, throughout the Bible, the number 7 seems to be something favorable to God, something that denotes completion or perfection. see this with the 7 feasts, if those two are considered as one, the 7 days, the 7 years, and even after 7 cycles of 7 years, that year at the end of the 7 cycles was something very important to God. Every time they had 7 years, 7 times, which would make 49 years, the 50th year would be a special year. It'd be the year of Jubilee. And in this year of Jubilee, they had certain commands to follow. This was a great year. This was a year that everybody waited for. When the year of Jubilee came, all debts were canceled. Nobody owed anybody anything. All the lands go back to the previous owners. All the slaves are set free. And no one has to work. It's a great time. It was a year that was joyous. But the reason that God gave this year was so that the people would not oppress each other. He was helping them to stay in peace. Look at verse 17 of chapter 25. Here he gives the reason for this. Therefore you shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So, reason is, he did not want them to oppress one another. This chapter teaches us that God does not give laws that oppress. He gives laws to do the opposite, for us to be in peace. When we look at Christ's law, it works the same way. He's not giving us laws that are beyond our reach. He's not giving us laws that are extremely hard to accomplish, that no one will ever accomplish it. He gives us laws that we can obtain, that we can do, but they're given so that we can be at peace with one another. Now, I went through that one real quick. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that? Good. This next chapter is a chapter that needs to be understood. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this chapter. When it comes to this chapter, Romans chapter 11, verse 22 comes to mind. Therefore, consider the goodness and severity of God. In this chapter, God promises blessings or rewards to those who obey, and God warns of cursings or punishments to those who disobey. Now, as we've gone through Exodus and Leviticus, we've seen over and over and over again, do this, I'll reward you. Don't do it, I'll punish you. He keeps saying that over and over and over. When the people fail to obey these commandments, whose fault is it going to be? It's the people's. God is showing his love, he's showing his grace by giving them warnings of what they need to do. Let me show you the outline. Verses 1 and 2, we have the commandments. Let's take time to read that. Verse 1 and 2. You shall not make idols for yourselves, neither a carved image nor a sacred pillar shall you rear up for yourselves, nor shall you set up an engraved stone in your land to bow down to it. For I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. And we already talked about that. What do the people have to understand every time they hear the phrase, I am the Lord? I am the Lord your God. They have to be holy because God is holy. We saw that in Leviticus chapter 11. These commandments that were given in verse 1 and 2, they are going to be the commandments that they have to remember. Because later on, these are the commandments that they disobey. Because they disobey these commandments, they end up disobeying all the other commandments. Now, why is that? Because when they chose false gods, what does each false god going to give them? It's going to give them a law of their own. Not only do they have God's law now, but now they have laws that they got to follow for each one of these gods. And all the laws that the false gods are going to give them, which basically the people make up, they're going to be contrary to God's laws. And that's why God says, don't follow other idols. And what is one of the things that burn the children. Well, where in God's law did he ever allow that? And so it all comes back to don't worship false gods. And first of all, God is worthy of all praise because he is the true God. But look at verses 3 through 13. He says, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and perform them, this is what you'll do. Look at verse 4. Then I will give you rain in its season. The land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall last till the time of vintage, and the vintage shall last till the time of sowing. You shall eat your bread to the full, and dwell in your land safely. I will give you peace in the land. I shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. I will rid of the land of evil beasts, and the sword will not go through your land. You shall chase your enemies, they shall fall by the sword before you. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 shall put 10,000 to flight. Your enemies shall fall by the sword before you. Sounds pretty good, right? If they do this, look at all the blessings they're going to have. They're going to have protection, they're going to have peace, they're going to have produce. You know, God is, when people look at the Old Testament, some people will say, well, God is a cruel God in the Old Testament because he punished the people. But you got to understand also that God said, if you do these things, I will bless you. He's not just this God that just punishes if you don't do what's right. He's also a God that rewards, and he rewards greatly if you obey his commandments. Now, the next verses, they're going to be sad in that God is going to give them warnings of punishment. But what makes it sad is that when you go through the Old Testament, all these punishments occurred. And they occur pretty much in chronological order. He gives 12 main punishments that they will receive if they don't obey. Let me just read them for you. He says, if you don't obey, I'm going to give you sickness, defeat by their enemies, withholding of rain, crop failure, attacks by wild animals, siege from other nations, plagues, food rationing, which ultimately leads to cannibalism because there's no food, desecration of sacred places, devastation of cities and sanctuaries, and finally deportation to foreign lands. However, God will not give all these punishments all at one time. He actually gives them in increments of time, and he gives time in between for them to get right. Now, some of them will be grouped together like the first two, but for the most part, these punishments are laid out in hundreds of years in spans of time. God shows them long-suffering. Notice the verses that separate them. Look at verse 14. But if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, and then he goes on to say, this is what I will do. Now look at verse 18. And after all this, if you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins, and this is what I'll do. Look at verse 21. Then if you walk contrary to me and are not willing to obey me, this is what I'll do. Look at verse 23. And if by these things you're not reformed by me, but walk contrary to me, this is what I'll do. And then another time, look at verse 27. But after all this, if you do not obey me, this is what I'll do. Look at all the chances that God is giving them. Even in the times that he's punishing them, he stops the punishment and he gives them a little time to get right. And as you go through the history of Israel, it's like those punishments, one by one, are not enough. And so God has to say, you know what? Just get out of the land fully. You're going into Babylonian captivity. And when Babylon comes in and they take all of them out, they leave only the poor people and they leave only the diseased. There's only people that are left in the land. And that's why God, knowing this is why God gives in verse 36 and following. Look at verse 36. And as for those of you who are left, I will send faintness into their hearts, the lands of their enemies. The sound of a shaken leaf shall cause them to flee. And so on and so on. And so we see the people that are left, they're just frightened. They're just shocked in their minds. And anything scares them. But in verses 40 through 45, walk contrary to them and have brought them into the land of their enemies. He goes on to say, I will remember my covenant with them. He's basically going to bring them back into the land. Guess what? That's exactly what happens. God is, in his giving of the warnings, he's also giving what's going to really happen in the future. When the people come back, guess what they do not do? They never go back into idolatry. Because that's what started it all. Of course, they will have other problems. They'll have other sins that they'll have to deal with. But they learned their lesson. Now, how does this apply to us? These punishments, all the way to the very last one, the Babylonian captivity. The time from the giving of this law to the time of Babylonian captivity, we have a span of hundreds of years. When you think about us, how long has God given mankind time to get right with him since Christ? How long? About 2,000 plus years, right? 2015 plus years, somewhere around there. He gave them hundreds of years. That's his long suffering. Now think about how much patience and long suffering he's showing us, giving us thousands of years to get right with him. But just like back then, God's long suffering and patience is eventually going to be used up. God is also a God of justice, not just long suffering, but he's also a God of justice. There's going to be a point in time where there will have to be punishments to be laid out to everyone in our time. And he warns us just the same. You know, it would be a cruel God if he would just come out of nowhere and never give us any warning and just punish all the disobedient. But he doesn't do that. He warns us. He said over and over in the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles and the disciples, the holy men that wrote the New Testament, over and over you see warnings of what God is going to do. So, how do we know that God will keep his promise? Well, we see in the Old Testament that it happened. Now, very quickly, I know we only have a couple of minutes. The last chapter is basically about redemption of vows. Now, let me give you this in a nutshell. Chapter 27 is different than the holiness section that we've been looking at. It's a standalone chapter, and for that reason, people have come out and said that this chapter doesn't belong in Leviticus. It was added by some people, but that's an unproven theory. The chapter makes sense why it's there. The chapter is about voluntary vows or offerings. It's basically ending the way the book started. Talks about vows, talks about offerings, voluntary, and talks about voluntary offerings in the end. But also, what God is teaching the people there in this chapter is that don't make vows or promises that you cannot keep. If you do, you have to pay a certain amount of money. You have to redeem yourself with a certain amount of money. What did God do in chapter 26? Did he not give them promises? But at the same time, did God give any provisions for himself in case he doesn't follow through? Why does God not do that? Because God means what he says. He's going to keep his word. He's going to keep his promises. But then he turns around and he shows us, but you, unlike you as mankind, you don't keep your promises. But you look at me, I keep my promises. What does that mean for the people? What do they have to do? They have to keep their promises. And so it makes sense why this chapter is at the end and after chapter 27. Also, say this very quickly before the bell rings. James chapter 5 and verse 12, there it teaches us that we cannot swear or give an oath or a vow of any sort. We have to let our yes be yes and our no be no. Now God allowed them in the Old Testament. He allowed them to make these vows. He didn't command them. He says, you can make these vows, just be careful. But not anymore. God tells us The one word that should come to mind when we think about Leviticus, that is the word holiness. How does one get right with God? It's through a sacrifice. Particularly